All right,
Perfect. And I hear you guys.
wonderful.
And we hear you.
Okay. It's okay. I believe I know how to do this. Okay. Can someone let me know if it looks okay online?
Yes, that's good.
Right.
Yay.
Maybe.
I'm gonna turn this over to you. This was tough. because
Hi,
you didn't
everybody.
handle this little bar. And if it's okay, I'm gonna get some sheets and
Yes. Thank you.
take it away.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That was a lot of work. We're in New York. It's a huge pleasure to be here at NSF-Geosciences, which is sort of the birthplace of this, of the project, certainly on the climate modeling side. With more work to do, our National Science Foundation grant, I think we have a few pennies left. We've spent it pretty well. And some of us will be in Barron in June to talk about the work, but we're going to actually have talks even today about strategy. There's a lot of papers yet to come with this work, a lot of thinking about the work and how we integrate paleoclimate proxy records with climate modeling, with historical data in the period we're looking at, which is the last 3 centuries BC in Egypt, which is the first well-documented society on the planet. With enough historical records. We can't go further back than that with a lot of written records. Not that written records are everything. They're the traditional historical métier. But what we're doing in the project and what historical work does is try to integrate historical information, archaeological information, which goes even further back in time with paleoclimate proxy records and climate modeling at higher resolutions, which is the exciting thing, I think. But I'm learning a lot even today. And let me just say, this is really important to have these exchanges between historians who are interested in this kind of work and climate scientists kind of broadly, because I think it changes the game completely. This stuff is resisted. How do I advance? Sorry, I'm a village idiot.
Definitely not to worry.
Okay.
We just had to go. Okay, so you should be able to
Just
use
hit-
those or
okay,
this big
cool.
one. That should work.
Where was I? It's changing how we do historical work in general. Let me just be kind of radical. Historians resist this. They don't resist climate change at the moment, but they do resist this kind of work, like massively. It's still controversial, which constantly surprises me. So I'm kind of like this older gadfly saying, for goodness sakes, that's just it. This is baked into my DNA. I grew up in Chicago, and in the 60s, it was a great children's television in Chicago. For whatever reason, it was superb. And this Czech film from the mid 60s was serialized on TV every 5 minutes while I was having my cornflakes. Has anyone seen this film?
Esta do Pop?
Journey to the Beginning of Time. It's a Czech film, but it's set in New York. 4 boys are in the American Museum of Natural History. They go through the dinosaur hall twice. They fall asleep. They decide to go for a boat row in Central Park. They encounter a tunnel, which doesn't exist. I've looked for it. It's not there. But under a bridge in a tunnel, and they row themselves into the Pleistocene.
Oh,
And they describe fauna, everything, and they keep going to go back in time to the beginning of time. It's an extraordinary film about natural history and how to teach science in a way. I find it, it was in the back of my brain when I was a little kid, and I'd forgotten about it until this project, until sitting at the Desert Research Institute steps with Joe McConnell. Was going in for the first time. There was a lab test that I had to pass to get into his ice core geochemistry lab. I was worried about it, which triggered my chemistry classes in college a lot. But I remembered this has been a journey for me actually since I was a little kid. So I'm thrilled to be here because I have this sympathy for all this work and joining these things together, although it's hard. So that's a story of not only NSF-Geosciences here, but the ice core geochemistry lab that Joe McConnell runs in Reno, which is just I'm fascinated by it. continually. I have taken graduate students there. It's important, as we talked about this morning a little bit, that grad students in ancient history, and I have one who just finished, who's quite brilliant, who's been on the project, Joe Morgan, who just got the tenure track job in ancient history in the country this year. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, fantastic. Great news, because that stuff doesn't grow on trees, but because of this sort of work. So little by little, people are saying, oh, maybe this stuff actually matters. But it's about it's about the ontologies and the difference between the ontology in history and climate science, broadly speaking, where there's a huge disconnect all across the board. And we have to do this a lot, talk to each other. And I think our project, if I can say I'm proud of it, we're a pretty cohesive group. The last 5-6 years, we like each other, I think, mostly.
That's why you're here.
Maybe it's all fun, but also there's kind of back and forth questioning. I'm really good at village idiot questions, and I think that's important to do. Now, the historical context, and I had to bring this up in Paris, but I think he matters. He's somebody. I'm not sure how well read he is these days. He should be. Emmanuel Ladurie just died in November at an old age. Who was the pioneer of climate history? Probably one of the pioneers in climate history, actually from the 60s forward, who wrote a lot with not a lot of science. His book from late 70s, early 80s in English, Times of Feast, Times of Famine, which is climate and history of the last 1,000 years in Europe. It's a classic. But he said in those pages that, well, over the long run, climate probably really doesn't matter in terms of the big historical changes. The reason he said that is that he was afraid of being called a climate determinist when he wrote that in the 70s. And that quote is often used by historians saying, well, even Ladurie backed off that climate information is anything can inform any kind of historical change or whatever time scale. However, he wrote in the 2000s, mid 2000s, a huge 3-volume work in French, going back to climate history with all kinds of data. Now going, oh, actually, it really matters even at smaller scales. It's phenomenally good. It's really important. And you can see the changes. Well, he was not certain in the 70s about what he could claim in terms of climate information and environment. But in the 2000s, oh yeah, we can actually start making some important connections between historical change and crisis points, et cetera, and climate information and environment. It was, computers were coming, they were getting better, climate models were sort of coming, et cetera. And it's really important. So you can see even him changing quite a lot. So he had backed off, like we really can't go so far in the 70s, early 80s, but oh yeah, in the 2000s, it's a different story already. And how have things changed even since then? A couple of books of him are important just from an historical point of view. They're both about environmental context, although not about climate change. On the first one, Montaillou, which is kind of a classic in French historiography about this French village in the southeast. Very much a micro historical study, small scale, a village in a couple of decades, for example. But he also wrote The Peasants of Languedoc, which was longer term, multiple century scales about environment and climate and so on. So in order to do this work as an historian, he was criticized, so he's all over the map. There's Laurent Ladurie. He one time he does this, the other time he does this, and it's climate, he's all over this. It was coherent, actually, as a strategy. The point is you have to do both small scale and larger scale historical work, as well as climate and disease information, which we now have with different questions involved. Environment is some kind of constraint, which is important for historians who say it's all about human agency. Climate is really not so important at whatever scale. Well, human agents are constrained by environments and by climate change, and they're constrained by societies too, which the human agent camp, which is pretty big in history, kind of tends to forget. So there were constraints, but also climate change is a force of agricultural production in a world which was all about agricultural production before 1900 everywhere. It's really important at least multiple scales. That's the kind of stuff that historians are with this material, I think are thinking about scales of time in society. In 2004, in volume 1 of this climate book, this is his ultra cool statement. It's telling all of his critics, which are huge in European history, it's no longer possible for fashionable historians to sarcastically dismiss the new discipline as false science. Really strong language. The time for jeering is well over, and the present work now addresses the history of human climate. I think human climate interactions is what he means, considering the impacts of climate and weather fluctuations upon our society, particularly agricultural output and in certain cases, epidemic disease. Yeah, I mean, that is kind of the agenda. He said, all these critics saying you're determinist, the things he was worried about in the 70s. No, the time now is to get to work with climate science and climate modelers and so on, because there's a lot now in terms of historical dynamics, which I think is the really great thing. So this great man, everyone should read. And there's a nice essay that summarizes his work that came out last year in a journal that people don't read, the New Left Review, but it's an extremely good article summarizing his thinking from the 60s until he passed away in November. It's really, really, really good stuff. So that's kind of the context of my thinking about history and working with you guys, working with climate scientists in general. At different kinds of scale, what are the historical dynamics? And then the challenge is how much environmental change at what scale makes a difference, as opposed to resiliency. For example, when I was in Paris, medieval historian came up to me afterward and said, yeah, but there's grain storage. There are no food crises. There are actually no famines. And the famous one in the 14th century that he worked on in Europe, famous decadal-long famines, one of the worst famines in European history, according to most historians with large books on it. He said there was no famine. There's plenty of grain to distribute. You can't actually ground actual famine from all the panic and fear in lots of the historical documentation. He said there's grain distribution. There's plenty of resilience built in Europe in the 14th century. And he said probably Egypt too. But well, in Egypt we can store grain actually for 2 years max. That is your buffer. In a place like Egypt. I'm not sure about Europe. I got to go back and look at what he thinks. But there is a window to how much grain, how long you can store grain before you're in some serious trouble. And that's what we've been working on with the Nile and the annual flood, because that's important. We've got 2 years before you're in some serious stuff. And that's why there's quite a lot of fear or worry every year, including lots of religious rituals yearly, where elites and most of the population are in these drunken, licentious festivals for a week at the low ebb of the Nile every year, to kind of level the social hierarchy, because the Nile might not flood this year. We actually don't know if it's going to flood. That's kind of year by year. So that's an important dynamic, I think, for Egyptian history. Yes, I hope you guys all think the Holocene is interesting. It used to be fashionable to say climate scientists don't think the Holocene matters very much. It was the Younger Dryas or the Eocene are way more interesting, and so on. But the Holocene is, there is fluctuation, obviously, which I think we can see now clearer than we could even a decade ago. And that's the kind of framework that we are doing in this project. And this is us happily in Dublin, hosted by Frank Ludlow on the right, Michael Siegel, a brilliant undergraduate at Yale who's since graduated. She was our coordinator. Jen Marlin, the paleo fire person at Yale, my other Yale colleague, and then the lecturer, of course. A few of us. Where were you, Costas, in this? You were not in Dublin.
I don't remember.
Equal was at the same.
I think there was a contest. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't remember.
Anyway, it was a good time. We had a good conversation, and every time we get together, we've had this great conversation, and the conversation continues around how do we combine paleoclimate records. It's mainly ice cores, of course, we're working on it, and volcanism, which we think tells us something about East African monsoon behavior. But there's other things too we're trying to put together, including speleothem records from the Middle East and elsewhere, that there's telling a more global story, which we think is also there, but yet to be written about. I think there's work yet to come on the global story. This is the call we're in, the CNH call. Historians hate this, coupled natural human system modeling. And this is a simplistic version of what is actually that. Multiple levels of Earth systems, multiple levels of society and environment that we have to integrate. It just visually to show you this is actually hard work to do. we're at the early stages of figuring out how do we integrate at scales on what we're looking at. And I think that is not easy. And a lot of climate work now is sort of saying, well, there's climate change at whatever scale, and there's historical work or historical processes. But the integration is actually super hard. So lots of conversation yet to come, I think, on doing historical analysis better. I'm not sure it informs doing climate work better, but I think doing historical work better, that after all, we're dealing with complicated societies, even in antiquity. And that is, we often forget that. We have to think harder about what's going on in the society. And the Nile River Basin is really interesting. The whole Sahara is interesting, of course, from green to desert Sahara. And these settlement shifts, which are one of the sparks for Egyptian civilization in the 5th millennium BC, with processes of migrations into the Nile River Valley, of course, and from the Near East across the Sinai into the Delta. At roughly the same time, once the wild Niles settle down and the Nile gets more manageable. It's an interesting longer-term historical process that's a driver of Egyptian civilization, of course, not relevant to us. It just illustrates there is these kind of fundamental structural patterns about Nile River, which is important for the whole Holocene with respect to the Nile. And the archaeology is pretty good for Egypt and the Nile Valley that tells us something about the history of settlement patterns from this green, very wetter Sahara to this desert Sahara. I find that those mechanisms really fascinating and I think important at a larger scale. The Ptolemaic period and later, so Roman period, Byzantine Egypt is famous and the only place in the Mediterranean really where we have this density of written records in Egyptian language and Greek language, often dated to a specific day. So it's as high resolution as you can get. That tells us something about economic conditions and sometimes even about Nile River conditions. And we've now coded in the project a database of, I forget how many records we have. It's several thousand, though. We have almost every year, the last 3 centuries BC, of some kind of information about what's going on in the Nile. It's mostly inferred. It's mostly qualitative information. We don't have Nile River flood records surviving. God, I wish we did for this period. It'd be easier for us. But we have something, and we're working on this, trying to integrate what we think is Nile River behavior with Jim Staggy at Ohio State, who's done a hydrological model of the Nile River, which I think for the first time, the most studied river in the world. It's amazing. This hasn't been done, but it's really interesting with a lot of implications for regional variance on the floodplain topography. I think I'll get back to it. I think I have one of Jim's new slides where we've coded all the historical information because we know where every village is in Egypt. We've geocoded all of our information. And it's a modern floodplain topography because how could it not be? But almost every single ancient village is sitting on exactly highline land where it should be in the model, which we jumped up for joy going, oh, actually this looks like a relatively decent floodplain. Even though it's 2,000 years on, it more or less reflects where villages and towns are located on the floodplain, which is what we expect. I don't need to go through all this. I'm talking earth science to you guys. That's kind of silly, but there is this literature, of course, that you all know about connecting explosive eruptions to the Nile watershed, which is sort of the origin of our project with the VIX project that Allegra was one of the founders of, and Costas has been involved too, and Ram. And that's the basic, Egyptologists, by the way, this basic mechanism we think don't know about it. It's still sort of coming, oh, maybe this is a driver of variability to some extent, but it's not in the Egyptology literature, it is in the climate science literature, of course. This is short-term climate forcing, obviously, it's annual or a couple years with errors in it. It's not centuries or the Green Sahara over millennia, of course. It's the stuff that Laurent Ladurie and most historians say don't matter. If you read Mediterranean history, there's no short-term shocks in Mediterranean history that make a difference historically. I'm summarizing. That's more or less the attitude. Nothing short-term matters. On the scale of like 1,000 years, something. Nothing short-term matters. We think that short-term tells us something interesting about human responses. And Egypt's one of the places we can do that. So from an historian's point of view, Now, this is sort of notional, but Laki and Katmai and Elgau in 939 in Iceland, and the nilometer, just to illustrate what we think is happening just physically with now flooding, it drops. But I've learned today that there's some lots more work to do on this baby, but this is more or less the modern nilometer record from Cairo and volcanism from this article in 2006. All right, that's kind of the basic background. Historically, and again, another origin of the project for me is I was working on unrest in the Nile River Valley in the Ptolemaic period, very well documented in a time series, pretty well established. Of course, we don't know everything, but it's a pretty well documented sequence over 3 centuries, with one exception, which is the last huge eruption, Okmuk, in 43, where there's no evidence of unrest, but we think it's possible the population was too weakened to do much of anything in the late 40s BC. So this is sort of basic idea, and from the historical point of view, sometimes these unrest periods are in a small region for a couple of years, but this one is 20 years, the longest period of social unrest in ancient Mediterranean history, outside of wars, is this big revolt. It's 20 years, which is really significant, where the entire river valley, with the exception of Aswan and probably with the exception of controlling the river itself, breaks away from Ptolemaic control. It's a huge deal for the history of the Ptolemies, this very successful Hellenistic period state in Egypt. And there's a lot of sources telling us about social unrest, about land going out of cultivation, even about dust feedbacks on land. It's not a good period of time. There's a lot of soldiers running around. And this is the context, by the way, of the Rosetta Stone, which is the 196 in the middle of this thing, where the delta included is in serious unrest for everything we know. The Rosetta, you never know from the Rosetta Stone. Oh, is great. The king who's 5 years old in the grips of these 2 courtiers, kind of controlling things. Life is good. He's put down this revolt. It's awesome. Well, probably not. It's one of the problems with historical sources, and I think Laura Landry is always right. Can we trust them, or how much ideology are behind these texts? We have to be careful with the sources and what they mean, for sure. Just like with climate information. I love this. You guys know this. I illustrate this in my lecture classes. This is ancient Egypt in a nutshell. The response to the East African monsoon that hits Lake Tana in June. It's the 80% or so of the Nile flood every year, and that this basic ITCZ mechanism is the thing we're kind of concerned about. It is really Egyptian history in a nutshell. The annual response to the flood, the social coordination around that anticipated flood, which we think is weakened or sometimes no rain at all, where you need it primarily at Lake Tana. Ice Core's Go Team, Ice Core Lab. I'm so fascinated by ICP-MSs in particular. They're kind of like magic machines that spit out interesting data. From our 2017 paper, which was the kind of the proof of concept idea, we looked at the chiral nilometer record from 622 AD to 1902, 1300-year high and low stand of the river, which is one of the longest climate historical records in the world, which has been doubted by historians. It's kind of made up data year by year. We can't use it for anything. What I think we've shown statistically with that 1300-year record and the Siegel et al. Nature paper is that there is some response to volcanism in that average in that 1300-year record like this. It's not a huge drop, 20 or 25 centimeters or so. But we're just saying statistically, this record is a reasonable historical record of high and low stands of the river, adjusted for the sediment increasing and stuff. There's all sorts of interesting issues with that, but we think it's been adjusted in this historical study. It's a pretty decent historical record. That's kind of the point of this superposed epoch analysis with these 60 eruptions from that 1300-year period of 1 watt per square meter minimum or larger. So that's kind of the point there. Here's me and with an ICP-MS in Reno, I know. But this is what I think historians should do. We need to learn your language. We need to learn how you guys think, and work is super important, I think. And we've hardly started that. But I think that's the future. is, I don't mind being a village idiot. But I think we kind of have to learn from each other and learn the language and what we're interested in. I think, which may be different things. So I think this is the volcanic record. The Ptolemaic period has 16 eruptions, pinatuple size or larger. The first 2 centuries AD, the Roman Empire at its height has 1. Now, I'm not going to say anything historical about that implication, but at least there are quiescent periods. Like now, we seem to be in a sort of quiescent period, right? Yep. And we can see that. And does it make a difference for political instability and so on? It's interesting that the last 3 centuries BC in the Eastern Mediterranean are very unstable politically and economically. I'm not going to say more than that. It's just interesting. But now, given that, and given that we can tie eruptions, including what's now not 44, but it's 43, winter 43 BC, with Joe McConnell's work. It might force us to go be better historians. I guess I wouldn't draw too many more conclusions than that, but I think it's kind of important.
Sorry, what are the blue lines? Are those optical depth or?
Oh, what's the scale?
What are the units? What is it?
Oh God. I can't, that's a good question.
Probably sulfur loading or something. in the
Yeah,
ice
yeah.
Paragraph.
Does that make sense in terms of number?
Paragraphs SO.
Oh, nice.
cores. It's
Okay.
2 paragraphs. Also.
Oh God, I should know that. I'm sorry, I forgot that doesn't have
It's really
scale on it.
large.
It doesn't have that it's, yeah.
I would think it's from NEAM. It's probably the
Yeah.
sulfate horizons themselves, like some sort of concentration.
Just-
number.
Okay, yeah,
That's my
good.
guess.
Okay, well. Does that satisfy? Okay, for now. All right. Historical record. On the right is how am I doing in time, by the way? I don't want to over.
Started
We
started late.
Okay.
So definitely go till 2:10.
Yeah.
Oh my God, okay.
Over half an hour.
I won't try your patience. On the right is my favorite ancient document from anywhere. It is important, I think. Some people don't believe it.
What is Sakia?
A Sakia is what you're looking at there. It's usually an oxen-driven compartmented wheel, geared wheel that lifts water onto higher lying land. It gets introduced into Egypt in the 240s BC. And think Archimedes in Alexandria, who's actually drawing these things up on paper. I think that's interesting. But we know irrigation water lifting devices like the Sakia are being introduced in the countryside in the 240s BC for the first time in this period. That's interesting. On the right is a text dated by the handwriting, and I think the context from the same period. Do I have a translation? Here's this text. Greetings from Philotas. A fire signaler is somebody in charge of smoke signaling, which is used along the river to signal flood heights every year. And it probably comes out of the Persian Empire, not just in Egypt, but also probably in Euphrates. He's also a soldier. In southern Egypt, at this great town that's called Edfu, one of the great temples in Ptolemaic period Egypt. It's the best preserved temple in Egypt in any period. Given that now for a long time there's no flood, I want to inform you, dear king, of a certain machine or maybe a technique. It's techne in Greek. So it could be vaguer.
Art,
Yeah, some kind of method
yes.
or
Craft.
a craft. Yeah, it could be that. Or technically a machine. The use of which does no damage, but by means the whole country may be saved 3 years of no flooding. The dryness it will produce a famine. So we're pretty much on the verge of that. But if you wish, this will be a year of good flood. So please give me a meal ticket for 30 days. And I want to show you this thing in Alexandria. Send for me. I want to show you this thing. It is kind of weird. Now, given the handwriting, it's kind of printed. It's not very cursive Greek. It's not a professional scribe. It could be this guy himself, or someone think, well, it's just a literary story. I think it's real text, but it also doesn't matter if it's a literary text because it's contemplating this idea of really bad flood and a human, individual human, not the king, saying inventing something that will actually improve the irrigation conditions. I think that's kind of the interesting point there. And I think the middle of the 3rd century BC is rather important. And we're waiting for Ram and you guys to produce a model of the 240s. That's yet to come. But the 240s is the first period of crisis in Egypt. It's a serious one with unrest, with Ptolemy shutting down a war successfully in the Near East, which would have changed East Mediterranean history so fundamentally, and goes back and imports massive amount of grain from rain-fed territory across the Mediterranean that Ptolemy's control back into Egypt, which is spectacular. Nice resilient response, and it's massive scale if that actually happened. But we hear about it. So I think there's a real crisis in the 240s, and I think the context is interesting about this letter inventing some new thing or new technique. The 160s also is another period which is fundamentally important in Mediterranean history that we've looked at, and thanks to RAM and you guys' model, I think it's interesting. But we know a lot about it. Major war, 2 invasions by the Seleucid king, the rival of Ptolemy's, the one in 168 really successful. He crowns himself Pharaoh of Egypt. We know that from historical documentation. That is almost on the verge of the Ptolemies dying, but Rome intervenes. Famously, line in the sand, kicks out Antiochus and his army. Interesting, but there's massive internal unrest in Egypt. A new fiscal arm of the state is created at the latest by 162 in response, fiscally or taxation-wise, to the crisis. There are dynastic disputes in the mid-160s. There's, at the end of it, one of these priestly decrees like the Rosetta Stone, which is essentially a contract saying priests support king, king supports priests and all the gods in Egypt. We have a nice political equilibrium. Life is good, whether it is or not. That's more or less the political agreement. And the second coolest text of all time is a document from 165 BC, which we don't have on agriculture, but we have the text written the next year that was circulated throughout Egypt to all Ptolemaic officials, talking about a massive lack of water, fields going out of production, the requirement of forced leases of land at reduced prices to get production going again in the middle of the 160s. The language of this text is extraordinary. It's unique. It's angry. It's using swear words in Greek, saying what the F is going on. The chief of the finances in Alexandria writes to his officials saying, when I said last year to get everyone into the fields and get crops under production, I didn't mean taking active duty soldiers in Alexandria off their duties and put them in the countryside. They don't know anything about agriculture. You bunch of dunces, but they don't use the term dunce. And it's extraordinary language. This is a really stressful period, we know from historical sources of all kinds. And we even have letters from a wife to her absent soldier husband in 168 saying, where the heck are you? I'm trying to survive with my son. The price of grain has gone through the roof, and you're not here to provide anything for us. Like, what is up with this? So we can put these stories together for the 160s BC internally in Egypt, but also externally. There's also the Maccabean revolt in Jerusalem, which one of our postdocs has now tied, we think, to drought in the Near East. It's really interesting. That's not part of the historiography of the Maccabean revolt at all. It's all about religion. But it looks like there's some drought in the Middle East as well. So we like these decadal studies. This is what's sort of what we're doing. Sort of one of the next steps are to write the historical work now on these decades, which we think, and again, this is not statistics. This is just, coloring book. Look what happens, mapping the shutdown of the wars, the periods of social unrest, the priestly decrees, and volcanism, essentially. And this one is in watts per square meter. We labeled this one, including Okmuk, which is not to scale on this program. So, I think we know something historically that these are stressed out periods, and we think now river behavior kind of adds something to why it's so stressed out internally. It just sort of it doesn't make things better, for sure. I think it makes things worse. Interesting. Just as an aside, because we've done no work on this yet, but I think our guy in Dublin, Francis Ludlow, as a postdoc in Chinese history, in the 160s, 163, the year after this angry letter, also in China, the high official of finance is saying, what the hell is going on with agriculture right now? That's interesting if it's monsoon, Indian Ocean wide monsoon failure or weakness. And the language is also pretty interesting. Like, we don't know what's going on, but something is out of whack here seriously. And agriculture statewide in the former Han Dynasty is really dangerously out of control. Okay, let me turn to literary. I'm not a literary guy, and I drive my ancient literature colleagues crazy. But there are 4 copies of this text. This is the 3rd century CE or AD prophecy. It's in Vienna now, but it's a text originating in the 160s BC, written in Egyptian. This is Greek, so it's a copy several centuries later from an earlier Egyptian text, and it goes back. The tradition goes back into ancient Egypt. It's called the Oracle of the Potter. This is the beginning of it. The river, there's no water, there's no flood, so the land is scorched, the sun is darkened. It's not willing to observe the evils in Egypt. The earth doesn't respond to siege. The farmer is pressed for taxes, but can't pay the taxes because there's no crops. There's internal fighting in Egypt. There's an invasion by Antiochus IV, which is 168. Everyone hates this guy. The country's in confusion, and everyone leaves Egypt because it's so horrible. And it prophesies the coming of a really good king who will save the day. The winds reverse, which we know happens with the monsoon sort of moving north. There was a reversal of winds coming off the Mediterranean, apparently. And so it even mentions that, and the king will save the day. It's an old literature for sure. It's interpreted as anti-Greek in this case. The Egyptian priests actually don't like the Ptolemies, the Greeks in Alexandria, and the military guys kind of pressing for taxes and so on. So this is just a response that we want a good Egyptian king to run. I think this gives us the historical mechanism, though, even of volcanism, if I can say. There's no flood, the soil is dry, darkened sun. Not the sun god Re is upset with the world, I mean, maybe metaphorically, but it's actually observing that there are dust veils, possibly. Farmers stressed, stolen crops, internal unrest, invasion, migration, murder. The city of Alexandria is laid waste. We want to come back to the ancient capital of Memphis. A good king will come, the floods return, and life is good. It's a statement not of anti-Greek sentiment, but of current king must suck. That's the technical term, because look at the now flood failures. It must be the bad king. Good king, bad king is a very ancient thing, not only in Egypt, but lots of places, including China, that the king makes the claim over controlling the environment. And when the environment is not going well, it must be the king is bad. The king must be replaced. That's my interpretation of this thing, which is really interesting. I think the mechanisms from veiled sun to flood failure to what happens in Egypt, it's all sort of there, conceived of in this literary kind of religious way. And again, in the 160s, we have 4 eruptions, and we've seen that now with the model and a lot of societal things, and the Babylonian astronomical diaries, which is one of the another great historical records for the last 6 centuries BC. There's dust veils, probably certainly dust noted atmospherically, and severe cold weather, and volcanism, and documented flood failures, we think. So we can begin to tell a historical story that's way more complex, with some percentage of mechanism being now flood stress. But there are other things going on too, which we're just beginning to tell. Here's your guys' work, which we can talk about. But this kind of work, and maybe it gets better, and so on, I think even lends more support to more global kinds of history. That the reason why East Africa and East Asian monsoons are not doing well, maybe right in here. Finally, Okmuk, the paper that Roman historians hate us for. A little bit, I'm exaggerating slightly, but only slightly. This is the largest eruption, of course, in the last 2,500 years. Produces the 4th coldest decade of history and the 2nd coldest year. Apparently, the tree rings tell a decadal long response to cooling against the background. But it's not just Okmuk. There's an eruption before here, for example, and we know this now. Flood failures back to 50 BC, the 2nd year of Cleopatra's reign. There's already problems. We know this flood failures from historical sources in 50 and in 48 BC, in addition to what's happening in the late 40s. So it's a pretty stressed out decade as well that we hear something about from our historical sources. So again, this is the kind of history we want to do, at least decadal scale history. Year by year maybe matters less and it's harder to do, and we have less historical records. The forties BC famously has not a lot of records, historical records from the forties, but we have enough to know there's serious food issues going on and local responses to that. But yeah, finally, the Nile hydrology. This is Jim just sent me this. Jim Staggy. He can do sort of low, medium, high flooding, like here. And we can see sort of regional, we can begin to see regional water issues possibly, because we know there's a regional story with now flooding, even in good years. And we have the major towns and villages kind of mapped here, and you can see it's on higher lying land, which is also sort of interesting. I'm hoping Jim can tune this to volcanic eruptions in particular. We can actually see what does Okmulgee do to the Nile floodplain, which will be better kind of history, I think, to understand regions, because we have a lot of documentation from here and from northern Egypt.
What's the
That we
difference
hope we can
between the two figures?
I think it's high and medium flood. Maybe high and low. On the left is high water, and he's taken the British records of Nile flooding and Nile flow and so on is extraordinary. It's modern, it's early 20th century, but the details in it, Jim Staggy was blown away by how much detail are in the old British Nile records, flows and depth of the river channel, and all sorts of information that he's sort of worked with and then modeled this with the magic of hydrological modeling, I think. This hasn't been done before. I think this has historical implications, a little bit finer dynamic detail rather than good flood or bad flood or something like that. We maybe know a little bit more on a floodplain. What does it mean for particular regions? And he's just finished the whole river valley. The delta is really hard to do, but we have the river valley anyway.
I wonder when he finally publishes this, if there will be modern implications like of the dam, like, oh, we thought that you were taking this much water from us, but
Yeah.
really we know that it,
Yeah. Well, you mean the Aswan, the high dam at Aswan.
yeah.
Yeah, but also Gerd, of course, which is a serious issue. I think it's the most militarized border now in the world.
Yeah.
And it's really, I'm trying to go there, but it's really hard to get to the dam. I'd like to see it, but I think there's some serious issues around water. And Egypt, of course, claims the entire river historically, and they go back to a British contract that was made in the 1920s that says Egypt and Sudan only control the river, the Nile Basin, through which now 15 nation states flow. So there may be some serious political issues around water sharing. We see that in Sudan right now as well, which is seriously important, I think. This is volcanic forcing of the from Okmulgee, which we think shows in East African drier and the Mediterranean wetter and cooler, which we think has an impact on agriculture. So let me conclude by kind of so what which is the important question with all this stuff. We have to understand societies in more complex ways. Does the loss of complexity mean the loss of adaptive capacity, or exactly what, or is it more? So how do we understand Egypt or Rome or medieval France in terms of their adaptive capacities, their resilience, mitigation, technological response? I think we've seen that even in the Ptolemaic record. There's some technological responses, even and economic responses, which seem to be pretty good in terms of the state. The Ptolemaic state doesn't collapse. It gets taken over after pretty soon after, 13 years after. The Ptolemies don't go away, although sometimes they were close. And how do we understand movement, migration? These are the big historical questions we all kind of think about. But I think the ancient historical record too is giving us more dynamics. Laurent Ladurie said that from his point of view, over scales of 50 to 200 years, French peasantry is immobile. Like there's no significant changes. That it's histoire, you move it. But I think the climate information and the modeling gives us a hope of understanding more dynamic changes. Society's responding in some ways, not maybe massive changes of agricultural systems, because Egypt doesn't change massively, but there are new crops in Ptolemaic period and so on. There's technological changes. We have people like Archimedes who are inventing new irrigation schemes and so on. So all of that, I think, is a richer story. History, moving history, not an immobile history. I would respond to the Ladurie that we can begin to tell different historical stories, actually for the first time. And I think it's almost all thanks to climate science and just climate models. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. You finished early.
I know, I didn't want to.
Well, we definitely have some time for questions. So, okay, yeah.
Yeah, okay, I have two.
Okay,
The first one is I just so happened to be watching Connections on Sunday. It was James Park, and he was talking about, in ancient Egypt, them recording the flood data with these
Mhm.
little ticks.
Yeah.
Right, was this actually recorded? Is this some of the data that you use?
no, we don't have ancient, we have a couple of nilometer records. They took it every year back to the old kingdom, back to the third millennium. And we have some things from the mid-third millennium. And there are issues with it, but this was done every year. Usually at Aswan in the south, so you can predict what the whole flood will be, because it takes several weeks to go from Aswan downriver to Alexandria. They did take these records, they were measured, we just don't have them. We recorded them. No, what we have are the Cairo nilometer, which is 622 AD.
Wait, why don't we have them?
They don't survive.
Dang.
Yeah, that'd be
Frustrating.
well, yeah, I mean, we know they took
Wait,
them.
were these all records that burned in the Alexandrian fire, or what became
No.
of it? Or they were just written on things that were delicate? Like, what happened?
So stuff doesn't survive. And there, I mean, during the Theban revolt, for example, there are sources that tell us that rebels, whoever they were, maybe just Egyptian farmers, I mean, it's unclear exactly who's rebelling, but it's wide scale. They're burning records offices, which happens in rebellions historically. So we lose a lot from that. But Egypt's the best documented place in the Eastern Mediterranean world. We have whatever estimate, 0.0001% survive of what was actually written. So we don't have a whole lot, to be honest, even though we relatively, from the Ptolemaic period, we have something like 60,000 Greek documents, and probably half that number of Egyptian language records. So that's the scale of what we have. But compared to what was actually written, it's not a ton. So yes, we should have them. And we have a couple that we have in our database.
My second question, thank you, was, I'll be just really quick.
No problem.
Has similar work been done for, I think I read some stuff about it, like in the 500s AD, there was a really bad volcanic eruption. So it's like climate data, or have climate models kind of informed what might happen there as well?
436, maybe?
536 and 540 and
Oh,
541
540,
maybe.
yeah, that was.
The worst year to be alive, 536, and so on.
That's one of the coldest, like,
Yeah.
winters in Europe, yeah.
Yeah, it's the coldest decade.
We should do that one, yeah.
I know.
Norwegians have a project.
Maybe it's been, I don't know if it's been done at all, but I mean, that's a historically important period, obviously. Because it's also the Justinian plague. Which is
kind of
something.
The lab where I was working when I started grad school.
We modeled that. 540 is AD? No, 540 is AD. So that was one of the coldest decade in the record, and it is related to the two eruption happening in the course of 4 years. And so we try to generalize that kind of things for taking Pinatubo as it is.
Yeah.
But I think that was one of the ones, like in Andrea Burke's picture, wasn't that one of the ones where it falls kind of off the graph for being relatively low total volume of volcanic?
That's what you showed me this morning?
Yes,
Yeah.
versus,
Yeah.
the summertime temperature anomaly. That one, like, is, it's like the
Mhm.
endpoint that falls off, like, it's kind of different. Something's different about that one.
I think Julia had the next question.
Yeah, really fascinating talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm curious, so like you're looking at these, like the human response perhaps to the flooding and such that could have been induced by volcanic eruptions. And I'm curious if you've looked at all at the human response by or like directly related to the volcanic eruptions themselves, like what happened to like civilization, how did they react by that versus kind of like these more the indirect flooding or whatever.
Mhm.
Yeah, and kind of though that scaling kind of being more on the long term and impacting human civilization perhaps. I
Yeah,
don't know if it's different scaling. Yeah.
What is that called?
I think she's talking about things like Pompeii, you know.
Oh,
Yeah,
oh,
yeah.
local stuff.
Yeah.
Oh, right, right.
Yeah,
right.
kind
Yeah,
of
yeah.
local impacts from volcanic eruptions versus kind of the.
so most of these eruptions are nowhere near the Mediterranean, which is sort of interesting, which is why I find it interesting the Egyptians might observe, and the Babylonians for sure observed dust veils and weird suns and so on, that they can observe. But Vesuvius, of course, and Etna, the bigger one, I think, is recorded. And Etna, of course, famously erupts in 44, just before Okmuk. And there's a lot of Roman Julius Caesar and all the context of, God, the moon is red and all kinds of bad omens. That's probably Etna. And it used to be thought that Etna was the thing doing weird stuff to climate, but the Okmuk thing now is, since it's 43, and I think pretty securely did. That's sort of interesting. So the Mediterranean volcanoes, and of course, you know, Vesuvius, serious impact if you live in Pompeii, of course.
Naples survived.
But yeah, but so you know, there were people, and Santorini, of course, in the second millennium BC. Although it's archaeology, we don't have. I don't think we have. There's some literary text that people think reflects that huge eruption, which is interesting, but it's pretty speculative.
I get this is probably my own naivete, but like around all those eruptions, people did everyone just die or like was there like
So in some cases, we don't even know where the volcano was.
okay?
We just see the recording on the ice core,
Oh,
but we don't
okay.
necessarily know where it is.
Okay, interesting.
So,
Okay.
so the ones, some of the, in the ice core itself,
Yeah.
if there's little tiny shards of things beside the SO2, there's like trace geochemistry work that can be used to track down like, oh, this is a Mediterranean volcano. Oh, this is not. This one's coming from Alaska or whatever. But for the local things, I mean, it depends. Like part of the reason like Pompeii is so famous is because like we have these casts of humans. But in the Santorini eruption, it looks like there's a pre-eruption that drove everyone off the island first.
Oh, okay. Wow.
What happened to Vesuvius apparently is an eruption took course over several days. People left and came back, and then the really large eruption, which wiped out quite a lot of people. So that's. I want to know about Okmuk because if you look at the caldera, it was a big eruption, and you can just a spectacular looking volcano, which we're still trying to get to see. I'm still trying to fly out there. Also, not easy to get to, but that would have had a local impact on native Alaskans, presumably. But I don't know what we can find out about that other than
We
stories.
need written records, right?
Do totem
Yeah.
poles and things that like the people outside the Pacific Northwest, do they have like a climate history that we just haven't tapped into yet? Because
Beside tree rings,
well,
I don't know.
yes, like a hit,
Like
like a not
symbolic.
a paleoclimate thing, but like actual like right people or storytelling. I can't imagine they wouldn't. I mean, the societies there were pretty complex.
I think Native Alaskans would have known and would have observed, and it's probably taken up. I don't know enough about the Native Alaskan conditions or anywhere else, the local impacts.
But we don't have written records, right?
No.
So there was nothing. It's like
There's stories.
like the Indonesia or those areas. It's nothing survives because it's not written on paper or stone.
Yeah.
There's some oral tradition. I
Yeah.
was talking to one guy who went
Because,
to
I mean-
the Kauai eruption in the 1400s. He went to
Yeah,
this
this is
island,
kind of free.
learned the native language, and they said like 36 generations ago or something.
Yeah,
They left the
but
island.
that's really recent. If you go further back, like Okmok, which is in the BCs, then
Well,
unless there is written history, it's very hard to survive.
Obviously, these are giant force signals you're looking at here, but how much do we know about resilience to just kind of natural internal variability, right? Because some years the flood is really high, some years the flood is really low, and presumably we have records of that from, tree rings. We have records of global climate, certainly
Mhm.
from tree rings. And so how much do we know about societal resilience to just sort of the back and forth of internal variability? And how much does that affect the capacity to handle these huge externally forced shocks?
Yeah, great. I mean, that's a big question, Kate. Yeah, I mean, from the point of view of Egypt, and it's different in Rome or in Greece, presumably. But in the irrigated Nile landscape, they were well aware of.
Oh,
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just reading Gavin's message.
Oh,
Sorry, I'm sorry.
I'm
Please
monitoring
ignore
the
me.
chat.
oh,
Just ignore
oh,
me.
okay.
Sorry, sorry.
The Egyptians were well aware of the internal variability, which they didn't understand, but it was observed, and they didn't do mathematical studies of the Nilometer record pretty simply. Their mathematics are pretty simplistic in comparison. But the system is kind of built in for resilience. Traditionally, the fiscal system, the taxation system in ancient Egypt, which is the harvest share for taxes, which the Ptolemies also do, which is a little bit tricky for various reasons, I think. And sometimes taxes were forgiven, but the Ptolemies are much stricter with controlling things, which may be one of the issues. Why unrest under the Ptolemies and not earlier, as far as we know. So there's grain storage, which was pretty resilient everywhere, and there's interregional transfer. It seems to be king related as opposed to local communities figuring out, which is interesting. But again, the grain storage is about 2 years. So, and the Egyptians knew that, and that there's the religious festivals yearly around the low ebb of the river, which reinforces, I think, social solidarity and reminds the elite that they may not be elite in the time of crisis anymore, and they have to. All the ideology is feeding the hungry, clothing the poor, and tomb biographies, all the way back to the age of the pyramids. And that was the responsibility of elites to store grain in temples, but also to redistribute it in times of crisis. So that the whole system was kind of built into. The Nile is sacred, but it also, we don't know if it's flooding year by year. The Cairo Nilometer record tells us that 70% of the years in Egypt were normal floods. That means there's 30% of floods that are usually low to really low and occasionally super high, which is really destructive to all the irrigation, the dikes and so on. But that's kind of the 70% of years where look like they're reasonable. And then the taxes in general are adjusted to, well, you can't collect taxes here because there's no water on those fields, but there's water downriver. So it's like Lansing study of Bali. There's a whole water culture, I think, religiously through the temples that are connected up and down the river that connects all of Egypt socially, culturally, religiously. It's also kind of built in resilience. So the entire religious system, religious ritual, grain storage is linked from Aswan all the way to the Delta.
Natasha had a question.
Yeah, well, it's actually a similar question about the internal variability, but not so much of the floods. Internal variability of the drivers, and probably that's a question to the modelers here. How important was the volcanic signal versus the internal variability in driving this response? And did you notice any kind of preference towards a certain phase of that internal variability that amplified the volcano effect or something like that?
I mean, you probably know that there is a wind system in the Aegean, or a seasonal wind system called the Multani, which blows northerly on a yearly basis. And there are studies that are trying to connect the flooding of the Nile Delta to the Multani intensity every year. And there are worries that this is going to change with climate change, and Multani is going to change with climate change, and how that will affect.
That angle we checked out, but we should
And that
definitely
wind
check that
is
out more.
related with the greater African monsoon that is very seasonal there.
Yeah, that's the wind that's mentioned in the prophecy, which is really interesting.
It's mostly the volcanoes and the link to the broad global scale IPCZ, which is what we're capturing well in the GISS model, which is, pretty consistent. The IPCZ tends to go away from the hemisphere where you have a thicker AOD. So if it's tropical or northern hemisphere, it tends to push it further south, which takes it off the headwaters.
So
But-
that phase,
There's also a system of
But
high, low pressure over the Balkans and Turkey that's really producing a system.
I don't know off the top of my head. I don't think, I've never looked closely at how that system responds to volcanism, but we should
Well,
do a correlation. We've got all the
there is a
information.
paper about it. There is a paper about it.
We should do this,
in these
Natasha.
calculations that you've done for this problem, for example, you can see.
Yeah.
That the phase of variability, because you did probably several realizations of this
Yes,
volcano.
you have ensemble.
And so probably you can see which one would amplify or damp perhaps the volcanic response.
What did tropospheric aerosols do to the Nile flooding?
Well, if you would imagine that they might also decrease it, like if you had a re-emission of the dust, but we haven't got to that phase of Graham's research.
But we know that, the North Atlantic was cold. If there's an aerosol signal, it's anthropogenic, that shoved the IPCZ south. Like what happened to the
So
Nile?
the whole premise for this proposal was, because it's CNH, it's like how natural variability impacted humans and how humans dealt with things impacted the climate back again. And that was kind of the premise, that the volcanoes are causing this large scale perturbation, the IPCZ, shifting it further south, sabotaging the development of the Nile flood. And the fact that humans have essentially made this flood area a lake every year, you tend to have like really fine grained silt that's deposited in lake beds, which is more easily mobilized when it gets dry. So the idea was that on the years that if it fails consistently and it gets dry enough, then you can remobilize this as dust and reinforce that drying signal. But this second part, we haven't finished yet.
And also, the original proposal had a Mesopotamian component, because in Mesopotamia, there are even records about visibility data for, transient visibility for years and years. And we wanted to see how dust responds to certain climate variabilities that were headed, but that got descoped. So we didn't even touch it.
I think we finally like the Ram and Ron together quashed that bug, and we are ready to do that second part now.
Yes.
Yeah.
I want to be cognizant of time because it's 2:10.
Marcus had a question.
I did see that, Marcus, you had your hand raised earlier. So if you want to unmute yourself, maybe we can make this the last question for the seminar. If you can hear us.
No, that's okay. Thanks.
Oh, okay. All right, cool. Then I think we can close it there. Can we give another round of applause for Bill? And then Kostas has your contact info. Obviously, you work with a lot of people here.
Yes.
There
Yes.
was a drought in Africa, that's what happened.
One thing, we will be heading for dinner at like 6-ish, and to an Ethiopian place at Amsterdam at 1:21.